Hi everyone, thank you for joining today. We'll just give it another few moments till we begin, just waiting for people to join onto the call.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on moving your economics teaching online. We have a wonderful session planned for you guys today, and on the panel we have our wonderful speakers. We have our best-selling author, David Begg, And one of our Advocate Connect customers, Dónal Palcic, who is also a lecturer in economics for the Kemmy Business School within the University of Limerick. During the session, David will be talking us through his textbooks, his career, and the impact of COVID-19 on the economy. And then Dónal will then discuss delivery in the COVID area and some tools that can support us in the transition to online or blended learning. So now I'll just pass over to my colleague Afsana to take us through the housekeeping slides, and then we can begin.
Thank you, V. So just before we begin, I thought I'd run us through a few things just to make sure we're all comfortable on the call. Can I just do a quick sound check? Could you just raise your hands if you can hear me? There should be a hand-raising icon just above the chat. Perfect. Okay, I can see many hands going on. That's perfect. So I'll begin with the housekeeping. Just a bit of information for you guys. So if you, at any point the sound goes off, just make sure you are connected to the audio during the webinar. You can call in using your phone, which is a recommended method if you're having internet issues. However, I think most of you are dialed in through your computer, which is absolutely fine as well. Just another tip, if you are experiencing connectivity issues, do close down any kind of high bandwidth kind of platforms that you might be using, such as Netflix, YouTube. I know we're all at home at the moment with our families, so just heads up on that. And I've had a few questions regarding the recording as well. So the session will be recorded and we will be circulating that to you all after the webinar, and there will be opportunities for questions. And just a final thing, you probably all have noticed that you are on mute, but you can still engage with the speakers during the actual webinar as well. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions, and of course the chat box is just above that to engage with us. And then I don't know whether you can all see, but there should be a speaker icon just above the chat box on the right-hand side where you can provide any feedback. If a question kind of pops up from one of the panelists, feel free to use that. And now I will pass over to David.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Right, I am going to try and share my screen. Can you see it?
Not yet. I can't seem to see it.
Okay, let me. Sorry, I've lost the.
Right.
Still not see it?
No, it hasn't appeared. Have you been using the share content icon?
I just clicked on that, but it didn't seem to work. And now I've got a full screen and I can't get back to the share content.
Okay, if you press escape on your keyboard, that should take you back to the main screen.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
So you get
on share content.
You get online tutorials this way. Now share content, share screen.
Yep. Perfect. Yeah, so you can see your screen now.
We're in now.
Yep.
That should be it. Let me just get rid of.
So I can see how fast and how complete recovery.
Yeah. Okay. So now let me just go back to the top, and we're ready to go. Great. Thank you for your help. You see. So if you join a webinar, you get online tutorials as you go. I'm going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes. I'm going to say who I am. I'm going to describe my long relationship with McGraw Hill. And I'm going to use COVID as an example of what we've tried to do in the various books that we've done together. I am a professor of economics. I was the Dean of the Business School at Imperial College London. I have also worked as an advisor to many governments and central banks and indeed the IMF. And currently I'm also director of IP Group, which is a company that commercializes spin-outs from universities. We have about 150 spin-outs in our portfolios, ranging from £20,000 to £1 billion and a bit pounds. So life is interesting. My former students and colleagues, just to sort of give you some idea of the people I have mixed with over my life, I helped to teach Ben Bernanke, who was governor of the Fed in the financial crisis. I was a student with Mario Draghi, who was the head of the European Central Bank. I spent my childhood with Charlie Bean, who was the deputy head of the Bank of England. and I helped to teach Ken Rogoff, who until recently was chief economist of the IMF. What we all have in common is we're interested in macroeconomics, in monetary policy, and as the world gets more global, we're interested in globalization as well. I started working with McGraw Hill 36 years ago in 1984, when we produced the first edition of a book called Economics, which I wrote with my fellow colleagues Stan Fisher and Rudy Dornbush. Rudy, alas, is now dead. Stan has had a glittering career. He was deputy head of the Fed. He was governor of the Bank of Israel. He was deputy head of the IMF. He was chief economist of the World Bank. What we tried to do was to write a book that would let people understand the lives they were living, including the futures they hadn't yet experienced. The BBC were kind enough to refer to this as the student Bible in economics. It's like a Swiss Army knife. If you devise something complicated, it works for a little bit and then it stops working and nobody understands it in the first place. And after the exam's over, you haven't got it all in your head anymore. A Swiss Army knife is exactly the opposite of all of that. It's simple, it's obvious, it's robust, and it works in all kinds of situations you can't even imagine yet. And what we've tried to do is to write a book that feels like that, that's easy to understand, that works from first principles, and that's widely applicable. It's now almost nearing 2 million sales, and it's been sold in 10 different languages. We're now in our 12th edition. The 12th edition is just out in print and is about to go digital on Connect, but not quite today. We now have one more co-author, John Leachy Bernafka. So we have gradually broadened out over the years. 16 years ago, we decided that this book needed a little brother or a little sister. Economics is a text for a whole year, typically for first-year universities or final year in schools. And we tried to write a book in addition to that, which would distill the essence of it down to a one-semester course, especially for students taking business who perhaps weren't quite so deeply into economics. And it's different in that what it tries to do is it tries to pose the issues, the topical issues first, and then subsequently introduce the techniques you might be interested in learning in order to analyze it. And Economics for Business is now in its 6th edition, and that's what Dónal is going to talk about immediately after me. And McGraw Hill have been working for the last 15 years, I would say, in making these more and more digitally accessible, because we now, everybody understands that that's the way students learn nowadays. Let me try and take that very brief overview and apply it to a situation that we're all struggling with right now, which is, what do we do about COVID and what are its economic implications? It is amazing how important this event is, how large it is, and how completely uncertain it is. We have all kinds of estimates of who's got it and who's may have it and who could get it. And the truth is there's a huge margin of error on every one of those estimates. The only way to know for sure is to test everybody more or less continuously. We haven't got close to doing that. Most of the official estimates are almost certainly much too low because lots of them are just based on who happened to show up in hospital. And until we test populations or significant random samples of them, we don't really know. Now that's good news in a way because it means the more people who've got it that we haven't yet figured out have got it, it means the death rate's lower than we think because we know how many people are dying, but if more people have got it than we thought had it, it means the death rate is lower. And it also means that more immunity is probably built up in the population than we expect to have yet built up. So these are two byproducts of our failures to do it properly, but as a result, it's not quite as bad as it might otherwise have been. There's a big difference between how medics approach this and how economists approach it. Medics know they're held responsible for solving this, so they want to do lockdowns to maximize the chances of curtailing this as quickly and as comprehensively as possible, much of which, of course, is a very good idea. But economists don't just want to think about the cost of lockdowns. They want to think about, they don't just want to think about the benefits of lockdowns. They want to think about the cost of lockdowns. So there are several costs of lockdowns. The first is that other diseases go untreated. So things like cancer screening and all the other things just aren't happening at the minute to the same extent because everybody's in their house and too scared to go to hospital in case they catch COVID there. And the cost of that gradually builds up over time and will eventually overtake the cost of COVID itself, for sure. Even the medics accept that. The second cost is the huge economic cost of lost output, lost taxes, lost jobs, lost firms that will never recover. And these things will have an enormous effect that will make the austerity of the last 10 years look like a drop in the bucket. And since we know that austerity leads to poor health, leads to all kinds of disadvantage, leads to deaths, we have to figure in somehow how that cost is not just an economic cost, but is actually also a health cost. Now, one way to try and attack this is to say you've got two things you care about, health and economics, well-being, and in order to assess the two which are going in opposite directions, you need to have a relative price of the two things. So the way to do that, one way to do that, the London School of Economics, they've just undertaken a study published last month, where they actually work out an explicit price of well-being relative to economics. And they use that to calculate the evolving trajectories of the cost of the lockdown and the benefit of the lockdown. And from that, they concluded that for the UK, it would actually be sensible to start unlocking on the 1st of June if everything continues to go as it was projected to go when they did this study in April, because that's the point at which the cost of the lockdown starts to overtake the benefit of the lockdown. I know you're recording this, and I know I'll therefore be held accountable and taken to law courts and so on, but economists are much more sensitive than most medics are about causality and multiple causes of things. I mean, medics make statements like people who live beside busy roads have poor health and therefore diesel is bad for them. And economists say, yeah, that might be true, but it may also be true that it's poor people who can afford, only poor people can afford the house prices that are a bit close to busy roads. And the fact they're poor may produce all kinds of other reasons why they have poor health. And until we tease out these various things, we don't really have a good answer. So there's a big scope for economics in thinking about even the health part of what's going on in COVID. Now, what we know is that we're spending a fortune as a government and as a country, as a world, in trying to subsidize firms and jobs during this crisis. The more temporary it is, the more it makes sense to try and keep people connected to their firms and their jobs and keep things going and stop everybody just degenerating into bankruptcy and unemployment. All governments have been amazingly bold, aggressive, and rapid in trying to do that, much more so, I think, than we ever expected. And as a result, for a country like the UK, we expect our ratio of debt to GDP for the government to grow roughly from 80 to, I think yesterday the latest estimate I saw was 110% of GDP is what the debt might be at the end of this. And that sounds like a huge number. The EU and the Maastricht Treaty and all of that stuff was trying to set 60% as a maximum debt for people who want countries who wanted to join the EU. The economists have always said that was perhaps a little bit cautious. But just to give you a brief bit of history, when Britain came out of the Napoleonic War, its debt GDP ratio was 250%. And it was over 200% in 1914 and 1945. So, and after 1815, Britain dominated the world economically for the next 100 years. So it's not true that a huge debt GDP ratio is everywhere and always the cause of subsequent economic misery. And it's important to understand why not. The reason is basically that you can get your way out of the problem possibly by cutting government spending in the future to service the debt. But I don't think we'll do that this time because our public services have been absolute heroes in this crisis, and it'd be very bizarre if our first reaction to the crisis was to cut nurses' wages as a result. You can grow your way out of the crisis. So even though the debt continues to grow over time, GDP maybe can grow more quickly than that, and hence debt to GDP can begin to shrink a little bit. But I think we're probably expecting that the few years after this crisis are going to be years of dislocation rather than boom and rapid, above rapid normal growth. So it'll probably take decades rather than years to make a dent in this debt GDP ratio that we'll have accumulated. And for a small open economy like Britain, which has cut itself adrift from Europe and is bobbing on the open seas bravely on its own, it will be rather at the mercy of speculators, I suspect. And if the speculators get the idea that the government's not tackling the fiscal responsibility quickly enough, there'd probably be a rather big run on the exchange rate. So it's going to be an interesting period that we live through. We're not doing it all with fiscal policy. Who's buying all these bonds that the government is issuing in order to borrow all this money in order to subsidize all these things? Answer right now, the central banks are simply printing money to pay for it. They're buying the bonds with money they print. It's as simple as that. And what their story is that they're buying the spike while the spike is necessary, and then they'll gradually dribble it back onto the market and unwind their position over the next 10 or 20 years. Now, do we think that will be sufficient, or will we pay the price for the huge surge in money supply that we printed in the meantime? Because people remember that if you print money, you get inflation. What they need to remember is if you print money and people don't want to hold it, they want to spend it, then you get inflation because they bid up the price of things when they try to spend the money they don't want to hold. But they might want to hold this money. Today, for example, in Britain, the British government has just issued bonds at a negative interest rate. That means the private sector is happy to hold bonds at a negative interest rate today. And if you're happy to hold things at a negative interest rate, you're surely happy to hold cash at a zero interest rate. So there is some possibility that in this world we've become used to a very low interest rate, that the demand for holding this money that's been created will be moderately robust. And to the extent it is, it won't spill over into inflation. And of course, we're going to have high unemployment for a bit, and that's going to prevent wages going up very much. In the longer run, some of it will probably dribble into inflation. That is the classical way governments get rid of their wartime debt. They inflate it away. And I can't promise you that won't happen again. And it will also have to cope with the fact that as globalization breaks down and protectionism increases, prices will go up. I mean, food prices are going up all over the world at the minute because nobody's picking the crops. There's no food. There is outbreaks in the meat factories and all the rest of it. So it's going to be interesting to keep an eye on inflation as we go forward. I think we all suspect that until we get a vaccine, we're not going to easily get back to where we started. People are going to be reluctant to get on aeroplanes where people sneeze on them and all the rest of it. Some jobs will be gone forever. Some firms won't make it through the crisis. Some of this is what we call hysteresis, which means that things that happen in the short run have a permanent effect. They're not just temporary. Once you get rid of something, it's much harder to get it back again. And so there may be some scarring as a result of all of this, and increasingly even central bank governors are recognizing that. On the other hand, the crisis has also done the opposite. It's given a boost to some digital and other new forms of activity, which were coming anyway, but it's greatly accelerated the speed with which people have taken them up. So we may enjoy doing less commuting. We may enjoy doing more digital stuff. And some of that the reason Wall Street's hardly fallen is that the Amazons and the Apples and all the others have gone up enough to almost compensate for the fact that the airlines and the cruise ships have gone down a huge amount. Nevertheless, the world that we imagine that we solve this within 2 or 3 years, hopefully, we're still going to come out the back end of this with a lot more debt, with higher taxes rather than lower taxes, with less investment for a while. And we have to face the fact, I think, that COVID-19 is only one of many coronaviruses, and it probably won't be the common cold is a coronavirus. What we'll have discovered is we've had a big pandemic. We've had 2 other ones this century, and we may spend some of our time preparing rather better for the next pandemic. So I'm very happy to take questions when Dónal and others have had their say, and I hope we can come back to some of these issues and questions. So I'm going to hand you over to Dónal, who's going to explain to you how you can embody the digital experience in your teaching. Thank you very much.
Cool, thank you so much for that, David. And now Dónal is going to speak about the delivery side. As we can see, education is moving online more and more now. And I think Dónal will be able to share some really good first-hand experience of Connect and how everything can work. So thank you, Dónal.
No problem. Everybody can hear me and see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks to David for that. As David said, life is obviously going to be very different with coronavirus, and I'm sure, like myself, it's probably going to, everyone on this call that is lecturing is experiencing that right now, in terms of they probably have to move online for the last month or two of their teaching, and well, in my case, and I presume in lots of other cases, it looks like we'll be teaching online for at least the autumn semester. So just to give a bit of background as to what I do, I've been a lecturer in the University of Limerick, UL, for over 15 years now. And for the last 10 years, I've been teaching introductory microeconomics to usually between 500 and 600 first-year business students. So it's literally assume that most of the students there wouldn't have done economics for in their secondary school education. And I also taught intermediate microeconomics to second-year business students, mainly the same cohort who go on and do a small bit more economics before they choose their major options, to about 450 of them. I've used lots of different textbooks over the last years and to deliver these modules. The most recent, before I switched to David Begg's textbook, was Mankey & Taylor, the Cengage book, and I used their MindTap e-learning platform. I've used Krugman & Wells's and the Sapling Plus platform. And before that, I used Parkin's economics textbook as well, and the MyEconLab e-learning platform. And because of the size of the classes that I'm having to teach, I mean, I'd always been kind of trying to find new ways of engaging students outside of the class. So the kind of digital resources that came with textbooks were obviously very important to me, in terms of making sure, because there's very little scope for interaction in my lectures, that I could try and interact and keep students engaged outside of the classroom online. But I'd noticed that with the different platforms and textbooks that I used, even though it's compulsory for students to buy, the textbook and access to these platforms, when I looked at the activity stats, they were very, very low, and with really passive engagement, hardly any student engaging with the readings, basically maybe doing the online tests, and very little else. So in terms of reasons why I switched to the McGraw Hill platform and to David Begg's textbook, well, there's various reasons. Like, I don't make a decision to change textbook lightly, because every textbook is slightly different. And some might suit certain topics that you teach, some might not, and there's always a lot of tweaking to do. But the Begg textbook is obviously very comprehensive. It's used for micro in the autumn semester when I teach it. It's also used for macro, so it's integrated across the whole year for the students. One of the main reasons was, for me, it integrated easily into our virtual learning environment. So the university one doesn't use Blackboard or Moodle or other platforms. It has a Sakai-based one, which a lot of other publishers at the time I was using them couldn't actually get their product to integrate in, but McGraw Hill are obviously able to do that, and it's easier. There's less hassle, particularly with first-year students who have only just come in the door and they're suddenly in a huge auditorium environment, with 600 students, and it can feel very, very impersonal. So having all of this integrated into one platform was important for me. The other big factor was obviously the digital resources, and I'll go through some of these and how I've integrated them and how I sequence my modules to try and engage the students as much as I can online. But the Connect platform has a lot of different comprehensive assignment options, whether you want to run quizzes or tests. For the reading side of things, they have new application-based activities, which are kind of simulations. I'll talk about them. And pretty much anything else that you want to add in from externally can be easily integrated. And in terms of building your content week by week, it's very, very straightforward. It's a kind of easy enough system to use in terms of the building blocks that you might use for your 12 or however many weeks of teaching that you have, in terms of readings, simulations, whether it's some kind of graphing question that gets them to use a graph to manipulate it and show that they understand the concepts, etc., or whether you're running online tests or quizzes. It's all very, very easy to integrate and comes up in obviously a very nice structured way for students when they log in. I'd say if I had to rank the main reasons why I switched to the Connect platform, Number one on that list would have been the SmartBook functionality. So it's basically an adaptive reading tool. So before I would have obviously told students, you should read chapter 3, you should read chapter 4, you should read chapter 5, whenever I was doing whatever particular topic. But obviously very, very few of them were doing that. Whereas with the SmartBook, you're able to assign them the reading, and you can get very granular in terms of what you actually want them to read within the chapter. Obviously, if you want them to read the whole chapter, you can do that. But some bits maybe you didn't do. So say, for example, their income and cross-price elasticity. If I hadn't done that topic, I can literally just deselect it and say, you don't have to read that bit. And I can obviously look at the amount of time that I want them to spend on a reading and adjust that up or down and which subsections that I want them to do. And when the student is doing the reading, obviously then the key concepts that I wanted to assign them are actually highlighted as they're going through the chapter. And it's not like they can just click in, go off and do something, watch videos on YouTube, and then half an hour later click out. In order to actually complete the reading, they actually have to answer questions that demonstrate that they've understood the assigned concepts. And effectively, you do not finish the reading until you've answered all of the questions. So in this reading here, you can see there was 31 questions. They'd have to go through each of the concepts, answer a question, and the system actually adapts to the answers, obviously, that they give, but also their confidence level. Now, if I was really confident I had the right answer and I got the right answer, obviously the system says, well, okay, they know that. But if it's medium or low, or I get the answer wrong, the system obviously is, it'll remember that, and then it can actually give refresh quizzes or refresh readings down the line later in the semester to bring students back to concepts that they might not have done as well on. So it's a really useful tool there. And how I suppose I incentivize students to make sure they did all their readings, I had a reading per week, was that the 10 readings that they had during the semester actually became the weighting that was applied to the online test results. So they had 5 online tests during the semester, worth 20% of their overall grade. But if they hadn't completed all 10 readings, then the score that they got on their 5 tests would be reduced depending on how many readings they've done. If they only did half the readings, they got half the marks. If they did 0 readings, they got no marks. And basically it was a way to try and ensure that, well, it's not to try and punish students, it's for their own benefit. It helps them in the online tests that they take and the final exam, but it did lead to a very high level of engagement and most students actually doing the readings, which was a really key benefit that I saw from the SmartBook functionality. ABAs, the application-based activities, I haven't used them before because they're only new, they've come in, but I have been setting up my course for next semester and playing around with the different application-based activities that they have on the system. And they're another kind of really good addition because they're usually about 10 to 15 minute type role-playing simulations where, for instance, in this one for the economics of the pandemic, they have to basically act as an advisor trying to explain the impact of the current COVID-19 pandemic on the market for N95 masks. So basically, they work through that for 10 or 15 minutes, answering different questions, and it's kind of really good way of getting them to, I suppose, apply what they've learned in this case, the demand and supply topic to real world situations. And it's another really, really, I think, useful tool. Online tests, I mean, okay, all e-learning platforms have this, but what I liked about Connect was the fact that the randomization function was very, very good compared to other platforms that I used. And you could, because if you're setting an online test that counts towards an overall grade for 600 students, obviously you don't want them all getting the same questions, because the potential for them to game it and to share answers is obviously very large. But you can actually create, question pools for each topic that you're assessing, and maybe pull a random 5 out of 20 from each pool for a test for students. So trying to minimize the chances, I suppose, that they're all getting the exact same question and that the answers can get shared. So I found that very, very useful and a good way of kind of cutting down the problem you might see with cheating on tests over time. through that randomization and through the use of pools. And we have a very large test bank with lots of different questions on each topic, but you can also add your own questions or even edit some of the questions in the test bank if you don't like it, but you'd like a slight variation of it. Apart from those, which are all obviously useful tools, another thing that I made a lot of use of were the different reports available on Connect. So because it's such a large class, because it's obviously impossible for me to know everybody's name and even recognize people, there's so many people in the room, the reports that I could pull down from Connect were really useful in helping me identify students that could say were at risk or were just not really engaging or struggling and not performing very, very well on the test. So that's just showing one of the windows that shows, the time they spent on the system and their scores on different assignments. And you can even click on each individual student there, see what they're averaging, and see when they're connecting it to complete their assignments, etc. The at-risk report is another really useful tool where it kind of looks at the engagement of all of the students. And I think it's based on the number of times they've logged in, the number of assignments they've completed, and the scores that they're getting on those assignments. And again, for me, I thought that was a very good pie chart in that, almost 3/4 of my class were highly engaged. There was about a quarter of the class that were not as engaged relative to everybody else. And then there's obviously a smaller percentage there that really weren't engaging whatsoever. But every week I'd be checking these stats and actually emailing students that were in the bottom, say 10%, to see what, was there something that could be done? Could we put on extra tutorials? Did they need to come see me during office hours, and etc.? And I think students obviously appreciated that in that they could see that I was obviously watching, I was taking notice of how students were doing, and in lectures every week I was reinforcing this all the time, that it's an important part of the module and engaging with the content, and it's there really to help them. So the main tips, we're all looking at probably having to lecture online, which is a very new experience for me anyway, and I presume for a lot of you, but the main tips I would give in terms of trying to integrate all of this is the tools, the Connect tools, whether they be the readings or the tests or the simulations or any of the other functions on Connect, they can be really effective ways of driving engagement, but the key to all of this is how you integrate it. So the very first time I used Connect, and I wasn't as familiar, I probably wasn't as structured. I gave different readings, but in terms of the sequencing, sometimes they weren't exactly in line with when I was doing lecture content, and I just wasn't familiar enough with the system. But I learned from that in the second year, in that when I was giving a lecture on, say, supply and demand, they'd have the related reading that week to do. Obviously, they have to read it, answer all the questions. The following week, they'd have a tutorial, 25 students in a kind of a tutorial setting with one of my teaching assistants, with questions based on that topic. And the week after that, then they'd have an online test on Connect. Again, it was very, very structured in that kind of sequence, and students very quickly saw that, look, if they do the reading, it helps them obviously understand the concept better. Then they get a tutorial problem set where they go through that topic again, and then they have an online test. And I kind of had it sequenced in a much more structured way, which I thought helped to drive the engagement. And every single week, I would then obviously, at the beginning of every lecture, point to the different tasks that they had to do in Connect, show them some of the different activity stats, and if there'd been an online test where there was certain questions that caused issues, I'd go back over that content to make sure that everybody got it. So, Connect can be a very, very powerful tool in terms of all the digital resources, but I suppose the key really is to try and to sequence it as best as you can with your the content that you're delivering week by week, and communicate, I suppose, the importance of engaging with all of this as much as you can to students, so that they realize that all of this is to try and help them do better. And so just to finish off, David talked about causality earlier in his talk. I'm not going to say that this is a causal relationship that I'm establishing here, but what I have there is the overall exam result for all my students last autumn. On the horizontal axis, on the vertical, it's their online engagement indicator, which is a connect indicator that's based on number of logins, number of assignments completed, and their scores. And obviously, there's a clear upward trend, and that obviously it's just a simple, too simplistic a correlation, in that the more engaged students will obviously do better. But trying to kind of do a bit more in-depth analysis, I've also run, along with a colleague who also uses Connect, some regressions where we have information on prior abilities. So CAO points from Leaving Certificate. The Leaving Certificate is the final exam that students take at the end of their secondary school education in Ireland. And the points that they get relate to obviously the results that they get in that exam. So we have a measure of prior ability for every student, which is useful. We also know if a student actually did economics for the Leaving Cert. So about 15–16% of the class would have actually done economics before, and we can control for gender. And when we ran a number of different regressions, we did find significant results showing that assigned readings were positively correlated with improved academic performance. I think it was basically about 5% on average. So that's a letter grade, going from a B2 to a B1 in our system. And we did a bit of distribution analysis using some kind of unconditional quantile regressions just to see who might have been benefiting more. And really was students at the medium or above that were kind of driving the results that we were getting. And those, and I suppose the lowest quantile, the kind of very poor students, didn't really seem to benefit. But, you know, for a lot of those students, you know, it could be just they were weaker students or just not very interested in general. And, you know, whether they engaged or not wasn't really going to make much of a difference. But definitely for those at the median or above, there did seem to be a big improvement from doing all the assigned readings. Obviously, there's lots of caveats to this. It's not like this is going to be published anytime soon. There's other bits of data we want to use. We didn't have control groups or anything like that, but I still thought it was interesting to try and dig in and see what the impact of the higher levels of engagement I was seeing, particularly through the SmartBook functionality, and how that impacted on grades. So that's it from me. You know, myself and David are obviously happy to take any questions that people might have. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Dónal. I do have a couple of questions that have come in for both of you guys. So I'm just going to read them out and you guys can jump in and answer them. So for David, somebody's asked, has the development of your textbook changed over the years with the new technologies expected by students inside and outside the classroom?
Thank you. Good question. I think that the textbook continues to evolve in every edition, for sure. I'm always amazed how much it ends up being having to think about everything from scratch again. The economics moves forward. Topics that we have to apply it to continue to evolve. Nobody would have seen COVID coming 5 years ago, despite little outbreaks of SARS and other things previously. In terms of the pedagogy, I think McGraw Hill have done a fantastic job in providing. I mean, Dónal's just given you a great example of how think about how your kid. If you have kids, think about how your kids learn. If you've got little brothers and sisters, if you don't have kids. When I was a child, you know, the way people learned was they got a book and they started at page 1 and then they went to page 2 and then they went to page 3 and then they went to page 4. And learning was very linear. And chapter 20 built on what was in chapter 15 and that built on what was in chapter 10. Nowadays, if you watch somebody open a box with a new thing in it, they don't look at the instructions, they just start and they just try and do it. And when they get stuck, they press a help button somewhere. And learning is completely different in structure to what it used to be. People are more impatient and they are more expecting there to be various help facilities available, and they're less expecting to be told you haven't read page 1, so don't expect to understand page 2. And that has, without the digital support facilities that embrace textbooks nowadays, it would be impossible, I think, to do justice to that set of thought processes. So I think humans are wired differently than and as a result, having a digital accompaniment is not just an optional add-on, it's an absolutely integral part of the package.
Okay, thank you very much. And I've got a few questions here for Dónal on the Connect side. So someone's asked, how easy is it to set up Connect on your course, Dónal?
It's easy. I mean, obviously, there's anytime you switch platform, switch textbook, it's never going to be as easy as you had it the previous year with a course that you might be used to. But to be honest, I did find it very, very simple, because I think the slide I showed you, the week by week kind of building blocks, it really is as simple as, clicking add assignment, go in. If you're assigning a reading, it might only take you 2 or 3 minutes to set it up in terms of identifying the different subsections that you wanted them to do. An online test might take obviously a bit more time if it's the first time you've used it, but I know the McGraw Hill team, they can be very useful in terms of if there was a block of questions that I had used previously that I wanted added, that they can just do that for me, so that there's a bit of setup time and say an online test, and that you'd have to go through the existing test bank, choose the questions that you feel are best suit. And then if you want to add your own questions, you can either do that manually, which takes time, or as I said, contact the support team and see can they get the questions put up for you in a block format if you just send them a document. So it isn't that big an effort to set up week by week what you want students to do.
Yeah, and I know from our side we have an implementation team that can definitely help set up the course if we need to as well. So we're always here to support.
Exactly, yeah. There's lots of help.
Great. So thank you for all the great questions coming in. Another one for Dónal is that you set up weekly materials for your students. What feedback do the students then provide to you?
So I have an army of TAs. There's about 7 or 8 different teaching assistants that deliver tutorials. They see the students on a weekly basis, and they obviously go through a test, a problem set with them, but they also go through the readings and any kind of a particular issue that's causing hassle for, not hassle, but a lot of the class seem to struggle with. They can obviously work on that in tutorials, and they said that they've got a lot of positive feedback personally to them from students. And in terms of my own, the feedback that I got, well, we have to do teaching evaluations every year, and a lot of the kind of qualitative comments I got related to Connect, and the students being very, very happy with how it all, the sequencing of everything, how it all tied in together. And some of them even said that they just appreciated the fact that every week I was literally spending the first 5 minutes of every lecture talking about what they're meant to do that week, and looking back at the stats from the previous week, emailing certain students, even students that they say did very well. It's easy to set up a mail merge. I'd send them an email just saying well done and keep going, things like that, because it makes a difference, particularly I think for first years. It's such a new experience for them, going into such a large class environment, coming straight out of a 6 years in secondary school in a very small group, relatively.
Okay, thank you. And I think this question kind of adds to what you've just answered, actually. What differences can you see in your students after implementing Connect in your course in terms of interaction?
What differences? Well, I mean, I did show there was, I have seen an improvement in the exam results. Now, that could just be that given cohort of students. I'd have to, I can't say there's a 100% causal relationship here, but they definitely seem to be more engaged. TAs, my teaching assistants were saying that they found it an awful lot easier because students had literally had to have done the reading before they got to the tutorial to do the problem set. Whereas in the past, the TAs were saying, a student would come in, might not have been to the lecture, and had definitely not done the reading, and it was very passive in terms of the engagement. So I think there was a big change, particularly in tutorials, in terms of the engagement from students there. In lectures, it's not possible to just have a kind of lots of interaction because there's just too many students in the room.
Okay, we've got some really great questions coming in. Thank you so much, everyone. And another question is, how do you see analytics in Connect How do you use analytics in Connect to support your teaching?
As I said, I just monitor on a weekly basis to see which students are particularly at risk. So the first thing I always look for every week was what students aren't doing as well or just simply not engaging with the system. If they weren't, I'd send an email to those students just saying, look, I was on the Connect system. I can see you haven't been engaging with your readings, or you didn't, in your online test or whatever it might have been, you didn't perform maybe as well as you would have wanted. I usually phrase it in a kind of as nice a way as possible, but basically reaching out saying, look, these are my office hours, call in, talk to me, let me know if there's extra support. And what I often ended up doing every year was just having a kind of tutorial every second week that I delivered myself to about 15 or 20 students that said that they were really, really stuck. Just no matter how often I did it, they couldn't get the content. And I'd meet them separately myself in kind of tutorials. So it was really useful to just identify who's not doing well, who you need to be worried about. Not that I don't care about every other student in the class, but if they're doing well enough, then they're not as big a concern for me. It's the students that I suppose that I'm kind of losing, I suppose, particularly for first years in particular, that I found the analytics really, really useful.
Okay, great. And I've had a couple of questions coming from Elizabeth Jones, so thank you for your questions, Elizabeth. Dónal, it may be that you don't have the data yet, but did you find that overall performance on the final exams improved when you compared years where you hadn't assigned readings that contributed to the 20% assessment rate versus those years when students were doing the readings?
We have, but again, we're still gathering the extra bits of data. So getting access to administrative data these days with GDPR and all of those issues isn't exactly easy. But I have compared the performance of my most recent class last autumn to previous years, and yes, they are doing better. Whether that's down to the readings and the engagement with Connect. I mean, you can never. I don't want to be. You're missing some. If you wanted to do it properly, you'd need control groups and different things like that. But as best as I can tell, yes, it does seem to be having an impact, but it would need maybe a little bit more analysis.
Okay. And then another question from Elizabeth is: with the bank of questions, do you use the essay-based questions, and if so, what is the marking feedback process? Thank you, Elizabeth.
I actually haven't used the essay-based one. It's been mainly multiple choice, but I can see another question there about will you be keeping questions at 20% with the move to online teaching? Next year will be very, very different. So I've been told by my university that we can't have final exams in the autumn semester. So I don't know, every university might be different, but because they're never going to be able to hold a kind of a 600 students in a hall and the physical distancing that will be required, I'll have to do all of my assessments on a continuous basis, all 100% next semester on the same module, on my microeconomics module. So I'll have to do obviously more online tests, but I'll also have to introduce some essay-based answers. So it's not something I've used, but I will have to start using it next semester.
Okay, great. And then a question from Sarah. Thank you very much, Sarah. For Dónal, will you keep questions at 20% with the move to online teaching? We are being encouraged to move more of the assessments to continuous to match the current change in lecture style.
That's what I was just getting into there in my previous answer. I mean, I'm in the exact same boat. Next semester, all of my assessment has to be continuous. There can be no final exam. So I'll have to obviously figure out a way of assessing all 100% on a continuous basis, which will be difficult for the first years in particular because they're so new to the system. But that will mean more online tests, some of them being MCQ based, and also probably having to look at the essay based type of questions and using all the TAs that we have along with myself to get those corrected.
Okay, so nearly at the end of our questions. Another question for both of you actually is, what's your top advice for educators in light of the new teaching world?
I'll let David go first there if he wants.
Gosh, it's a big challenge, isn't it? And something to keep you. I mean, if life doesn't change, then eventually it gets boring. So it's not entirely disappointing that changes have got to be made. I think persistent relevance and the sort of ongoing monitoring that Dónal was talking about go hand in hand. So on the one hand, students respond to the idea that they're not being ignored, and if they know that people are watching what they're doing, they're more likely to do things. But on the other hand, you can't expect them to do infinite amounts of stuff if what they think they're doing is boring in the first place. So I think the more that we can make what we're doing relevant to the world that people are living in, and the more they think that the effort they're putting in illuminates their everyday life, then I think the more we can expect from them in return. So it's a combination of the technology that allows us to be Big Brother, in a sense, and the requirement on us to provide material that really genuinely seems worth studying.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. I mean, my biggest tip would be, I mean, I'm facing down the barrel of this myself. I mean, I think in June, I'm pretty much, I've been told by the dean of our school that, you know, there's a big action plan for how we're going to get everything online for the autumn. And anyone teaching large group kind of first year modules is first in line. They see that as one of the biggest kind of high risk, high visibility modules. So they want us to start front loading a lot of our content, and I suppose they use project management terms like scaffolding, but basically getting the structure in place for the semester well in advance, and having a very detailed course outline. Now, luckily, in the past, I have developed a really detailed course outline. It sets out exactly, look, week by week, this is what we're doing. Here's how all the assessment works. So I think from day one, students see that the structure and the sequence are obviously very, very logical, coherent, and that the expectation on my part is, you know, if they engage with the material, if they engage with the readings, obviously engage with the lectures, and do their online tests, it'll all help their overall performance. So really, it's about structure and sequencing would be the biggest tip I have, particularly when it's going to be online. It's going to be that bit more impersonal. I mean, normally I get to go in, you can see the whites of their eyes, you can walk around the room, they can see your visible presence, and it can be easier to, I suppose, talk to them in that type of environment. I think even more than ever, the structure and sequencing and being have everything front loaded for the semester is the top tip that I can give, rather than kind of arriving in week one and trying to kind of work on a weekly basis.
Can I just say something else, which is, I think this is going to hugely add to competition between educational establishments. If you take the parallel with retail, where Amazon and Walmart in the US have cleaned out everybody else and shopping malls are closing and everybody just does it all through Amazon nowadays. The more that we all do digital, the less distinctive there is about the particular educational establishment you go to, and in particular, the less physical bond there is. And the institutions that are a little bit lazy, let's say, in responding to this challenge, are just going to get wiped out. I mean, they're just going to find that their students stop coming and they switch to other institutions that put rather more effort into their online courses. Now, to some extent, this is a recipe for winner take all, and the big ones that spend fortunes on it will, I think, do a lot better than the small ones who can't spend fortunes on it. But wherever you are, I think you should spend as much on it as you can, because otherwise, I think you'll find, looking over your shoulder, somebody else is coming and eating your lunch.
Very good point. Thank you very much, guys. And I just wanted to read out a lovely comment that we had from Angela just now. After adoption of Connect from 2 years, much more engagement and better results for students, which is really great feedback. Thank you so much for that, Angela. And thank you to everyone who's asked such wonderful questions. So I'm just going to wrap up the session because we've come to 3 o'clock now. And I just want to thank you all for joining and asking such engaging questions. We'll be sending you all a follow-up email with the webinar recording, which also will include the slides. And if anyone's interested in learning more about SmartBook, we do have a webinar tomorrow, and my colleague Asana will drop that link into the chat box right now. And I just wanted to say, don't forget to stay connected with us on our social media accounts. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll have a lovely afternoon and see you all again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much.